I've covered the unreleased arcade games of Atari in the past and, well, it's kind of weird to do that and not also have a video that looks at the titles by them that actually did come out. It's not exactly the smallest of undertakings, but even if a look at Atari arcades does obviously entail a whole bunch of the most famous games ever made, there's plenty more than that to cover. This is a company that, at times, had a ludicrous hit rate on the floor. Seriously, even if Atari themselves could be quite a chaotic company, what with the switching over to Warner, the general party atmosphere in Sunnyvale and so on, the coin-op division, well, with which the Atari Inc. or Atari Games years, it's filled with legends pumping out a seemingly endless stream of incredible titles. Ed Logg, Dave Feuer, Owen Rubin, Mike Halley, Mark Cerny, Donna Bailey, Ed Rotberg, the list just goes on and on. Just the joy of playing these games, and not just the ones that are on the critical and commercial level of the likes of Asteroids, Missile Command, Gauntlet and so on, is enough to justify making this fit. And so, well, we've got a lot to get on with, so we best start. As the history of Atari in the arcade largely spread itself out neatly over 3 decades, it makes sense to do 3 videos and begin all the way back in the 1970s, a decade that they'll neatly bookend with 2 of the most successful arcade games ever, and naturally we'll cover everything in between. Also, for the sake of pure completion, I'm going to throw in the unreleased games as well, as they were covered in the unreleased videos, so we have all the Atari arcades in a neat little place. Let's get on with it. Of course, if you're covering Atari, you are basically covering the origins of the arcade video game. Now, I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on that as there's a whole lot of less covered ground to get to, but the whole story starts with Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney, 2 Ampex employees, forming a company named Syzygy Engineering, and the development of Computer Space, the first arcade video game. One that's essentially a coin-operated version of Steve Russell's 1962 PDP-1 game, Space War, where 2 players control 2 ships with dials and do battle against each other. It was, as it goes, not the only early arcade to take inspiration from Russell's game. Also in 1971, a pair of Stanford University students named Bill Pitts and Hugh Tuck created a prototype called Galaxy Game that used a PDP-11 and charged students 10 cents to have a go on, but unfortunately it proved too expensive for commercial production. Computer Space, on the other hand, did make it to production thanks to Nutting Associates. Bushnell and Dabney's version of Space War, made entirely out of integrated circuits, was certainly inferior to the PDP-powered Galaxy Game, but crucially, it was commercially viable seeing as it was based wholly on Dabney's video circuitry, with no microprocessors involved. The Galaxy Game proto was never really meant to be a commercial product seeing as it cost over $20,000 to make, and the Pitts-Tuck duo had no real way to downscale the production without ditching the PDP-11. Also, Computer Space adds more to the Space War formula. 2 players can take on each other in regular Space War fashion, but a single player can do battle against groups of UFOs. Ultimately, Computer Space ended up shifting around 1,500 units for nutting. It's often seen as something of a flop, but that's not really the case. Computer Space made a pretty decent amount of money, over $1 million in 1971. However, nutting did see the game as a commercial disappointment compared to their 1967 projection-based arcade title Computer Quiz, and ultimately Computer Space was the only game that Bushnell and Dabney produced for nutting before they decided to go it alone, soon renaming themselves Atari, basing that name on the game Go's equivalent of a check in chess. And of course, from there we reach the big one, the almighty Pong from November 1972. Computer Space was a curiosity, but this was the game that lit the fuse, a phenomenon that lit up the arcade floor like nothing before, becoming all the rage and starting the video game craze. Geez, I'm a poet and I don't know it. Awful rhyming aside, Pong likely caught fire where Computer Space didn't thanks to its ease of use. While it was reported that folks in bars struggled to figure out how to play the earlier title with its combination of dials and buttons and whatnot, The relative straightforwardness of Pong could be grasped immediately, and it only needed one hand on a dial to be played, leaving the other hand free to, well, hold a drink, play a piano, hit a taxicab, give a peace sign, you name it. It was immediately a craze, something that Atari would naturally follow up on. September 1973 would see the release of Pong Doubles, a 4-player version of the game where 2 teams could take control of the paddles. The 1975 Christmas period would see their home version of Pong get released through Sears, and there'd be many other iterations on the game by Atari, either released or unreleased. World Cup Football, Pong in a Barrel, Quadrupon, Super Pong, the licensed but unreleased Snoopy Pong, Puppy Pong, Dr. Pong that was designed to be in children's hospitals and doctors' offices, the pinball-centric Pin Pong, and so on. Now of course the big question, one that is still hotly debated to this day, is just how it all came about. One day, Alan Alcorn, Atari's 3rd employee and someone who'd also previously worked at Ampex, was tasked by Nolan Bushnell to create a bat and ball based game with 1 spot and 2 paddles. Unbeknownst to Alcorn, this was initially just meant to be a way to train him up and get him into thinking about video games, but naturally it progressed from there. As to where Bushnell got the idea from, well, that would be a matter for the courts. Nolan Bushnell always said that he had originally seen electronic tennis games running on a PDP-1 when he was a student at the University of Utah back in the mid-60s, sketching designs in his lab book. On the other hand, Ralph Baer, the man who made the Magnavox Odyssey along with Bill Harrison and Bill Rush, the first home video game console, claimed that Bushnell had simply seen table tennis running on a prototype of the machine and copied it. It was indisputable that Bushnell had attended a demonstration of the Odyssey earlier in May of '72 and had played the table tennis game, but he thought that it was, in his words, a relatively crappy product, and he initially wanted to see if Al Alcorn could make a better version of table tennis. The initial lawsuit was filed in May 1974, and the case ultimately dragged on for a little over 2 years before Atari eventually decided to settle with Magnavox out of court, entering an agreement to license Magnavox patents that ultimately had a negligible effect on Atari's profits. This was one of those battles that could have perhaps gone either way, but Ralph Baer's extensive record keeping on everything from the initial creation of his brown box prototype in 1968 and beyond was always something that helped out in this department, especially seeing as Atari was far from the only company that Magnavox ended up suing over a game of table tennis. As for the general success of Pong, one thing that did eat into Atari's profits far more significantly was that it didn't take long for many other companies to produce their own versions of the game, which they would do so with impunity, even if in a lot of cases, it ultimately meant facing the wrath of Magnavox. Of course, one good thing about this is that it means that Atari couldn't necessarily rest on their laurels. They had to create other stuff. Atari's first deviation from the Pong formula wasn't necessarily a successful one. That would be July 1973's Space Race, a game that was largely designed by Ted Dabney. Unsurprisingly, Space Race is a first in several regards. It's the first arcade racing video game, and the first game where you have to avoid any kind of obstacle, the goal being to get your ship to the top of the screen before your opponent, avoiding asteroids along the way. The development is odd, and again shows the sneakiness of the company. Initially, this was a game called Asteroid that Atari were making for Midway as part of an earlier contract that they'd signed. So they did that, Midway's Asteroid was released. However, Atari then immediately turned around and released Space Race, which was of course pretty much the same game. Midway understandably weren't too happy about that, and Atari ultimately had to enter a royalties agreement with their Chicago rivals over the issue. Although in the end Space Race wasn't a huge success, only shifting around 1,500 units. It couldn't hold a candle to Pong, or more accurately, it couldn't hold a candle to the army of Pong clones that were already filling arcades around the world. Space Race was also pretty much the last thing that Ted Dabney did at Atari. He left in March 1973, selling his stake in the company before the game was released. In the main, he was annoyed that the video circuit that he'd designed was patented by Bushnell, and that he wasn't included on that. Before we largely leave the almighty bat and ball escapades of Pong behind, it's worth quickly mentioning this one that we can play in MAME, Rebound from February 1974. This one's a bit more curious than the more typical hockey variations or whatever, as this one is based more in volleyball. You've got two paddles on the horizontal, and the goal is to hit the spot over the net into the opponent's side of the court. Now this certainly isn't the most famous variation of Pong, although it's a little more curious than the regular game, and it does allow us to introduce one of Atari's main competitors, although hopefully you got the quotation marks in between that word. Key Games was formed in 1973 by a man named Joe Keenan, who so happened to be a friend and neighbour of Nolan Bushnell, and on the surface they were competition, claiming that they'd hired people who'd defected from Atari. However, that was all a bit of a fib. Key Games was created by Keenan and Bushnell as a pretend competitor, with the aim being to get around the exclusivity deals that distributors demanded of companies. Key would offer clones of Atari arcade games, with Pong games such as Rebound and Pong being the first of these, renamed Spike and Eliminator respectively, as well as versions of the early racing games Gran, Trak 10 and 20, the precursors to the Sprint series, called Formula K and Twin Racer. The illusion of Key being a competitor continued for about a year or so, although it ended with the release by Key of Steve Bristow's exceptionally successful Tank, a more original title that initially came out under the Key name and was designed by Bristow to be something of an improvement on the older Space War, with controls that were easier to grasp. Now while it's tricky to play the original Tank through anything like MAME, we will be seeing some variations on it in a little while, and it was around the time of Tank's success that Key was merged into Atari. Still, with the Key name established by Tank, games would continue to be released under that name until 1978, so we will be seeing a few more of them as we go along. Now of course, the mid-70s is still the time when arcade games were largely discrete logic, with no microprocessors, and no games stored onto memory. Usually these games are classed as transistor-transistor logic or TTL, integrated circuitry and all that. And unfortunately we can't play the majority of Atari's arcade games from 1974 and 1975. Still, it is worth quickly running through a few notable ones. I already mentioned Steve Bristow's original Tank from November 74, a pretty important title as it was Atari's first truly huge hit outside of Pong, and it helped to stabilise the company. They really did have a lot of trouble when it came to following up their bat and ball escapades. Similarly to Space Race, October 1973's Gotcha is kind of important seeing as it's the first arcade maze video game, and even technically the first colour arcade game in one of its later versions, but it wasn't a big hit despite having a rather odd little design. It was known as the boob game inside Atari due to its strange rubber joysticks with buttons on them that did kind of look like a woman's breasts. March 1974's Gran Trak 10, while it appears fine in motion, as mentioned it's essentially the precursor to Sprint, tried a non-standard circuit design that aimed to stop competitors from merely cloning it, as well as being the first game to actually feature a ROM chip that was used to hold the track graphics. But the result was a very unreliable game that needed a lot of fixing up, and one that Atari actually ended up initially selling at a loss due to an error in the accounting. It performed well, but if Atari hadn't fixed this rather critical problem sharpish, it could have put them out of business very quickly. Touch Me, also from 1974, is another one that would have made Atari wince. First released as an unsuccessful arcade, it's basically the Simon Says children's game, getting a series of button presses and then having to match them. This arcade failed, but of all people, Ralph Baer, Bushnell's old enemy, thought the concept itself was a good one, created the Simon handheld, and had a whopping success with it. Well over 10 million units sold. One set all, I think. Atari tried to rejig Touch Me as their own handheld version in the wake of Simon's popularity, but the damage was done. There's a few other names that have largely disappeared into the ether from this period, although they may be important or at least curious in one way or another. There's Qwak from November '74, an unsuccessful light gun game that did find notoriety much later in a court case between Ralph Baer and Nintendo over Duck Hunt, with Baer claiming that Duck Hunt infringed on the original Magnavox Odyssey light gun, and Nintendo trying to invalidate his patent by claiming that Baer used both Qwak and his work on the Odyssey as a basis for the patent. It should be noted that Ralph Baer won his legal battle with the Big N over this and various other points of order, including, as ever, table tennis. Crash and Score, a Demolition Derby-based title from October 1975, actually beat Exidy's Destruction Derby to the floor by a couple of months, but Exidy's game would prove to be the more successful one, especially thanks to the highly notorious Death Race modification. There's the amusing shite-arsery of September 1975's Shark Jaws, a game that could have potentially been an official licensed game for Jaws. However, Nolan Bushnell failed to obtain said license from Universal. So what did Atari do? They plastered Jaws all over the flyer with Shark in almost illegibly tiny font next to it, and created another subsidiary, Horror Games, for the title in an attempt to shield themselves from any possible lawsuit. Some of the other games from this period can be played in other ways. A version of June 1975's Anti-Aircraft can be found on the Atari VCS cart Air-Sea Battle. Tank and September 1975's Jet Fighter make an appearance in Combat, while January 76's Stunt Cycle, a game at least popular enough for Atari to release a dedicated console featuring it, was to at one stage be rejigged for the VCS and become a licensed game, based on the Dukes of Hazzard. This didn't end up getting released, but a prototype is out there. One other title that's worth a mention here is Quiz Show from April 1976. While this one isn't quite playable in MAME, it's very important for one big reason. This game is actually the origin of the classic arcade game font, the one that is utterly synonymous with gaming as a whole, let alone just Atari or the arcade. The font itself doesn't have an official name, but it was very likely created by the legendary Lyle Raines. Atari's next huge hit comes in April of 1976, right around the time when they're starting to move away from transistor-transistor logic, or TTL. And of course, it's Breakout, originally designed by Nolan Bushnell and Steve Bristow. Once again, Breakout isn't a wholly original title. Not only is it designed to be a single-player version of Pong, a company named Ramtech released a game called Clean Sweep in 1974, designed by Howell Ivey, in which the player had to use the paddle to knock out dots as opposed to blocks. Still, much like Breakout, Clean Sweep, which was quite a successful game in its time, was itself designed to be a single-player take on Pong, and Atari iterated on the concept by completely closing off a big chunk of the playfield with blocks that had to be removed, as opposed to dots. The development of Breakout is also, of course, notable for the folks who worked on the prototype. A certain young hippie fruitarian named Steve Jobs, exclusively on the night shift because, well, his body odour stinks out the entire office, built the prototype with his friend Steve Wozniak, ideally aiming to get a bonus for using less than 50 IC, or integrated circuitry, chips. In the end, they used 42, enough for a $5,000 bonus. Infamously, while Jobs and Woz had agreed to split this bonus, Woz didn't know the exact number of said bonus, meaning that Jobs ended up giving him $350 and pocketed the rest. This despite Woz, by all accounts, doing the brunt of the work despite not even being an Atari employee. He worked for Hewlett-Packard at the time. His design was so perfect and so minimal in fact that, according to Al Alcorn, it was actually far too good. No one else was able to build what Steve Wozniak had done because they quite simply didn't have his mind, and Woz couldn't really explain it. And so Atari had to make a different board with more integrated circuits anyway. Anyway, this game itself is hardly one that needs an introduction. This was a majorly successful title, one with a long life that ended up shifting around 15,000 units around the world, and it's responsible for the entire block breaker genre. Hell, beyond mere block breakers, it's a major inspiration for Space Invaders too. Tomohiro Nishikado took the mechanics of Breakout, of taking out these blocks one by one, and adapted them into his shoot 'em up. So yeah, this game is a pretty big deal. Cannonball is, as you might expect for a 1976 arcade game, very simple and also obscure. In fact, the jury's still out as to whether the game did come out in the arcades or not. The aim of the game is much like the old classic carnival act. You get into a cannon and you fire yourself out of it, ideally aiming for the hole in the wall. Hit it and you carry on, don't and, well, you splat into the wall. The cannon goes back a bit further each time, so you have to hold the button down a bit longer in order to make it, and as you can see the graphics here are a fair bit corrupted even if the game is still playable. This is mainly notable for being Owen Rubin's first game. It was inspired by the game Stunt Cycle and took the young Rubin a few months to make. And there was a home version of it called Human Cannonball in 1979. We'll have a couple more Rubin-led games to look at later in this video. So, it's July 1976 and Atari made a big change. We're moving away from TTL and integrated circuitry games, and we're now using microprocessors, specifically the MOS Technology 6502, a chip that the original Atari will use for near enough all of their arcade games going forward, certainly the majority of them. Atari weren't the originators here or anything like that. The first arcade game to be stored on a microprocessor that was commercially available was Midway's Gunfight from November 1975, which was an adaptation of the Taito game Western Gun. Dave Nutt and Associates were hired by Midway to take Taito's discrete logic and adapt it for an Intel 8080. This is, of course, a total game changer, and it obviously means we can actually play more games going forward, which is nice. While Atari have used ROMs previously as part of TTL games to store some data, usually tracks and maps in the likes of Gran Trak and Tank, their first two microprocessor games came out in July of '76, and this one here is Cops and Robbers. It's a simple enough affair, although one that can be enjoyed by up to 4 players. You've got cops and robbers on either side, both shooting at each other, not usually thwarted by much aside from the occasional beer truck in the middle and each other's bullets, and whoever scores the most at the end of the allotted time has won. This can actually be played against the computer too, which isn't always the case for games of this vintage. Also from July 1976, we have Flyball. Yep, it's baseball. Not the first baseball video game ever, seeing as how there was a take on the pastime back on the Odyssey, but it's a whole lot more recognisable at least. This is a game for 2 players, one as the batter and one as the pitcher, and you've both got a trackball which you use to either hit the ball or move your man about, depending on who you are. The pitcher doubles up as the one solitary fielder. The pitcher's task is more involved as a result, seeing as how he has to intercept the ball and then touch the batter before they reach a base. And if they miss the ball and it goes off screen, well, that's a home run. This couldn't really be simpler as a baseball game, although it is honestly more fun than some of the other arcade baseball games I've played, and I've played more than my fair share. Amusingly, the game's 2 designers, Dave Shepard and Rich Patak, knew absolutely nothing about baseball when they made this. They largely managed to get it right, although Dave has a story in an interview about how having all the runners advancing on a walk, even if there were empty spaces in between them, actually caused a massive fight in a bar one time, because, well, it weren't the rules. I've already mentioned Tank a couple of times, seeing as how it was a big hit back in November 1974. Now we're able to actually have a proper look at it. The first sequel to the game, back in May 1975, was Tank 2, much the same sort of deal as the first game, only with a different map and still using TTL, but September 1976's Tank 8 sees the game make its way to a ROM, and as the title suggests, well, it's kind of a beast. Up to 8 players can fight each other on this single-screen map, with the cabinets being appropriately beastly enough to accommodate that amount of people. Playing Tank itself is much like any other tank-based game you may have played. You've got two joysticks that you work in tandem, one to move the tank and one to turn it. If you've played Battlezone, which in many ways is a 3D version of Tank, then you'll grasp this pretty handily. Now of course Tank 8 needs at least one other player to actually blossom, so we're not really seeing it in the best light here. However, the last game in the series, February 1978's Ultra Tank, does allow humans to take on the computer, and while it's jumping a little forward in the timeline, we're best off looking at it now. Ultra Tank is only a two-player game, although actually having a computer to play against is very nice, and there's also a few different maps to choose from. Of course, by this time, a version of Tank could be played in the home. The game was the main focus of 1977's Combat, which largely served as the pack-in game for Atari's shiny brand new console, the VCS. This also features a version of Jet Fighter, but Tank was the headliner. October 1976 sees another important game enter the fray. Here's Night Driver. Even compared to other games from this time, this one doesn't necessarily look like much now, but this was one of the very first first-person racing video games, and indeed one of the first first-person games anywhere. The game had a couple of inspirations. More immersive driving in the arcade had previously been achieved in electromechanical titles, such as 1969's Speedway, but a much more direct inspiration for designer Dave Shepard came from a flyer for a German arcade game that he didn't know and would never play. However, it gave Shepard the idea for the dark and minimalistic setting that defines Night Driver. Later on, this obscure German arcade was identified as Nürburgring Run, released earlier in 1976 by Dr. Rainer Furst, and while we can't play that game, you can see the influence it had on Night Driver from the flyer. The aim, of course, is to keep between the pylons, going as fast as you can and trying to extend your time, which you do if you reach 300 points. Very simple now, but this would be a big hit, a game that continued to make money through the rest of the decade, far outstripping contemporaries like Midway's licensed title, Datsun 280 Zap. It should also be said that even if the graphics may appear simple, when you're zipping through turns at top speed, well, the darkness and the pylons still make this game feel incredibly fast. Undoubtedly a great game. Time for another quite important smash. Racing games had long been a feature of Atari's output. We've already mentioned Gran Trak 10 and 20, there were the key versions of those games like Formula K and Twin Racer, other TTL titles like Le Mans, and now it's November 1976, and we've got the next iteration, Sprint 2. This is quite a big one, seeing as it's not just a top-down racing game that's strictly for the humanoids. It's one or two players racing against computer drone cars, with the idea that said computer cars don't merely drive the course in a fixed path that never deviates. Lyle Rains instead created a vector map that the drone cars would attempt to align themselves to, which it would do in a way that wasn't repetitive. The result is quite a significant improvement on the earlier TTL titles, and the game's a big hit, shifting around 8,200 units. Again, like the later versions of Tank, we've got the ability to change tracks around, and the driving itself is nice and speedy, particularly as you make your way up through the gears. Very nicely done, and naturally there would be several sequels, which have a somewhat similar naming scheme as Tank. We've got Sprint 8, Sprint 4, and Sprint 1, and the numbers indicate the maximum number of players for each game. You also get other improvements as we go through the versions. Sprint 2 is black and white, but the other games are colour raster, there's more tracks, the drones improve, and so on. Sprint 8 is the most entertaining of these games, what with the chaos of taking on 7 other drones and all that, but it's a fine and quite important series, and when we head over to the 1980s in part 2, well, it's going to be making a big comeback. We start 1977 with the release of Dominos in February, a game by Dennis Coble and Lyle Rains, and it's a snake game. a two-player snake game with the goal being to block out your opponent, surrounding them with your line and making sure that they either hit a wall or themselves before you do. You get a point for each win, and the game ends once you reach a set target number. Once again, this isn't necessarily an original title. Gremlin Industries released Blockade in November 1976 and quickly won a lot of praise for it, but it took the small Gremlin a while to really get the game distributed to arcade floors, and by the time they did, games like Dominos, as well as Midway's Checkmate, were already out there. Mind you, Coble, in a 2020 interview with Paul Drury for Retro Gamer, said that he was actually inspired by earlier Snake-style games that he'd previously seen running on ARPANET, as opposed to Gremlin's game. Dominos is, in the end, as enjoyable as any other early competitive Snake or light cycle type game. It's satisfying to watch when you've successfully got an opponent trapped, and frantic when the shoe's on the other foot and you're trying to escape a situation that's ultimately unwinnable. April's Triple Hunt is the first game to be released by Owen Rubin, who's mainly famous for Space Duel and Major Havoc, two excellent games that we will be seeing in Part 2. Not to be confused with the ambitious Tunnel Hunt, another game of his that sadly never got released in its original form. Triple Hunt is a light gun game that is actually 3 titles in one. The game that's playing is controlled by the dip switchers, and there's rather lovely overlays for each of the titles. You've got Witch Hunt, Raccoon Hunt, and Hit the Bear here, and they're all pretty similar. You simply shoot as many targets as you can, and you can extend your time by hitting a target score. This would all look very plain indeed if you simply played the title bare bones, but the overlays most certainly make it. They're really nice, adding a whole lot to the package. This fits in nicely with most of the games we're seeing here. They aren't deep experiences or anything, but, well, they're not supposed to be. Just a bit of fun for a minute or two. Dune's Drag Race, mind you, is actually one of the more in-depth early Atari arcade games. You wouldn't necessarily think that, seeing as drag racing is about going as fast as you can in a straight line, but there's a lot going on here. Obviously, the main goal is to be quicker than your opponent, but what goes into that? Well, first, you need a good start, reacting as quickly as possible to the green light. Then you need to gradually go through the gears, getting faster as you go. However, you mustn't change the gears too quickly, otherwise you'll blow your engine and have to start all over again. As you get faster, you're also going to need to steer your vehicle. It gets more unstable as you speed up, and naturally hitting the wall is going to slow you down. In the end, whoever gets to the other end of the screen first wins the point. And that's a whole lot harder than it looks. This is a damn fine game, and it's another one that came out under the Key branding, still very much active at this stage, even if it was years since it became clear that Key was just Atari under another name. David Crane also paid homage to the game in 1980 with Dragster, a very good home version of the game for the VCS. And of course, a game that people were talking about an awful lot many years later, thanks to the infamous and impossible 5.51 second record that Todd Rogers claimed to have set all the way back in '82, the debunking of which in 2018 ended up seeing his reputation as a professional gamer fall down like a house of cards. Another really rather entertaining game from this time is Poolshark, also from Dune. It's another title that Owen Rubin worked on. I guess you could say that this is one of, if not the first billiards-based video game ever made, although the rules here are quite different. You're in full control of the cue ball in Poolshark, and the aim is to simply move that white around the table and pot as many balls as you can, ideally getting every ball in the rack in the pockets before the timer runs out. There's no power, no real aiming as such, just rather frantic movement, although you've got to make sure that the cue ball doesn't breach the pockets, as naturally that's a scratch. It's the sort of thing that would totally be fun to do on an actual pool table, and doing it here comes without the risk of accidentally bashing your knuckle on an object ball, which would probably elicit loud exclamations of rather violent imagery. Each credit gives you 3 racks, and you get 30 seconds to try and pot the balls. As it turns out, potting all these balls in that short amount of time is actually rather challenging. A very fun little deviation, the sort of game that you're most definitely going to play way more than once when you fire it up. Next up from July is Starship 1, a game where, well, the inspiration should be clear pretty quickly. This is a bout of space combat that totally isn't paying homage to Star Trek, where you have to save the Federation from various alien forces by shooting their ships whenever they come up, receiving points for your troubles. The graphics are quite excellent here for the time, with big old ships that actually get larger as they get closer to you. Starship 1 may well be the first game to use any kind of sprite scaling, which is pretty neat. The game itself is just fine. It's definitely something that would be much better played on an actual cabinet, seeing as it comes with a setup where you seal a reflected image of the screen in order to get the space background, but an overlay does a decent job. Got some nice loud sounds and big explosions for the time as well, which is cool. A cool little thing, although perhaps not quite on the same level as some of Atari's more multiplayer-centric titles. October's Destroyer is a simple action game, a sort of which that you have probably seen before in one form or another. You play as a big old battleship, and you fire depth charges down into the sea, aiming to hit various subs that are lurking in the deep. There's a dial to change both the direction of the ship and its speed, but you're mainly going to concern yourself with the dial that changes the depth your charge is going to aim for. This is a game that's much more about timing than it is about simply chucking charges around left and right, and you get a decent enough explosion whenever you successfully take one of the enemy subs out. Definitely not a famous Atari arcade by any stretch of the imagination, but totally acceptable. How about some more top-down driving? September 1978's Superbug, designed and programmed by Wendy Allen, is the first in a series of top-down games where the focus is on single-player action, we've got a bit more detail, and there's a few scrolling tracks to take on, with various levels of difficulty. You tend to get a lot of top-down racing games in the arcade, so really Superbug hasn't aged too badly beyond the black and white graphics. The mechanics of the genre are pretty much all here from the get-go, including at least being friendly enough to tell you what direction you're about to turn in. If you've seen a few of my arcade vids before, you may know that I'm not exactly the biggest fan of top-down racing games, so unsurprisingly I'm not particularly hot on this one. Although the sequel to this will be a definite improvement, and we'll be seeing that in a few games' time. Next up, we have Canyon Bomber from November, also by Wendy Allen. This has similar controls to Destroyer, but the aim is different. Here you control a biplane and a blimp, and you have to drop bombs inside of a canyon. Wendy has described this quite succinctly as Breakout, only upside down. Crucially, you're competing against an opponent. The goal simply is to not miss any of the rocks that are inside of said canyon, or indeed the canyon itself. You lose a life if you miss, lose 3 lives and you're out, although I do enjoy being able to actually continue once you've beaten your opponent, seeing just how many of those rocks you can take out before you inevitably miss. After all, if you've only got a few rocks left in there, it's going to require absolutely ludicrous accuracy to drop one of these slow-moving bombs on them. Again, it's a very simple game that I get quite a big kick out of. It's actually quite surprising how well some of these nearly 50-year-old arcade games have held up, but then perhaps it shouldn't be, seeing as how such straightforward yet satisfying experiences are what the arcade is all about. Dirt Bike from 1977 is one of many Atari protos that are still yet to be dumped, although there is a monitor bezel of it kicking around. The idea for this game is pretty similar to the original Sprint games, only with bikes instead of cars and, accordingly, handlebars instead of a steering wheel for control. Dennis Coble, who worked on Sprint 4 and Sprint 8 with Lyle Waynes, started this project before it eventually got passed to Ed Logg. It seems like a good idea, but the inclusion of handlebars resulted in mechanical issues, and the game went on the back burner as Logg concentrated on Super Breakout. Eventually, Dirt Bike was pulled, although much later on, handlebars would be much more successfully implemented in 1985's Paperboy. So, 1978 is a year of pretty significant change in Sunnyvale. After all, the end of the year is going to see the departure of Nolan Bushnell as he falls out with parent company Warner, who acquired Atari in November 76, for the last time. The key issue that ousted Bushnell was the launch of the Atari VCS, where, in what's kind of a common theme for Atari, the company had built 800,000 consoles, but only sold 400,000 of them in 78. While the VCS would ultimately be very successful, it was a bit of a slow burner at first. Anyway, Bushnell was blamed for this, and he stepped down following a huge argument with Warner executive Manny Gerard, replaced as CEO by Ray Kassar. We also won't see the Key Games branding again. That's discontinued by Warner, and Joe Keenan would leave alongside Bushnell, joining him at Pizza Time Theatre. Still, despite all this brouhaha, things in the coin-op division are still thoroughly good indeed. We've got more crackers coming up in 1978, and March's Sky Raider is an excellent start. As you can see, this is a lovely looking game despite its age. It's a typical shooter setup, but with a different viewpoint, a slanted view that is, according to the flyer's blurb, supposed to make the simulation of flying feel a lot more realistic. It doesn't do a bad job of that for the time, and it still looks glorious, especially with the overlay. Quite a fun game to play too, bombing targets, avoiding enemy planes and all of that. It is funny really. The overlay and viewpoint of the game makes me wonder just how Sky Raider would play if it was somehow adapted to play on a pinball table. Now obviously you couldn't have done anything like that back then, as the cost, reliability and most certainly weight of the fin would have been utterly Costa del Blowfly, but I wonder if you could do some sort of adaptation of Sky Raider on a virtual pinball machine these days. Anyway, this game is very cool indeed. It's been 6 years since the arrival of Pong, and here in March 1978, Atari are bringing it back to the arcade floor. They're doing so in the shape of Tournament Table, and it's kind of amusing to think that people could potentially describe this as kicking it old school back in the late 70s. This is basically the arcade version of the 1977 Atari VCS Kart Video Olympics, and it's best summed up by a Winter 79 review from Video Magazine that says it features old standbys that are still lots of fun. Like that game, you've got a load of variations of Pong in one neat place. There's hockey, soccer, volleyball, basketball, handball, foosball, quadrupon, and a version of Breakout is also here as the only single-player experience. Anything groundbreaking to report here? Well, not really. It is, after all, an arcade Pong machine, and happily it's an easily accessible one featuring all the major forms. You also have games here that did eventually manage to get out, although they needed to undergo some changes. This is one such example, Dennis Cobell's Catch. This prototype is the simplest version of the form, but the finished game would have seen players try to catch flowers inside baskets using a paddle controller, not missing any as they fall down. Having previously covered Catch, we can obviously now follow it up with the actual released version of the game. Avalanche, from April 1978, is the last Atari game to be made by Dennis Coble, who had later found the publisher iMagic. This obviously looks a lot snazzier than Catch, but the core gameplay is the same, with you getting a big old bucket that you move around with a dial and catch falling rocks with. It's all nice and easy at first, but as you progress the bucket gets smaller and the rocks get smaller and faster. Naturally it becomes quite a frantic affair, and it's a fun little title. The game didn't do too badly in the arcades, but it became much more famous on the Atari VCS. Activision's Kaboom from 1981 is not an official conversion of the game, but it was very heavily influenced by it, and it ended up selling over 1 million copies, as well as inspiring various rip-offs of its own, including the almighty Beat 'em and Eat 'em. What a legacy. Dune's Fire Truck by Wendy Allen is the follow-up to her previous game Superbug. It's the same sort of black and white top-down racing dealie where you've got several tracks to choose from and you try and get as far as you can in them in the time you've got, although here you're naturally controlling a fire truck as opposed to a plain old car. Depending on the version of the game, this title is also known as Smokey Joe. I actually think the truck improves the game significantly. It gives it a different sort of challenge, one where you've got to take turns a bit differently in order to stop the truck from crashing, and there's also a few more obstacles on the road itself, such as oil slicks and parked cars. Also, while this feels a bit more conventional in single-player mode, this can actually be played by 2 people cooperatively. The front player controls the engine, and the back controls the hook and ladder. The rather uniquely designed cab for the game reflects this setup. I also really like how the game provides you with a bell and a horn. These have no use whatsoever, but it's fun to set them off just for the hell of it. In short, I enjoyed this one a hell of a lot more than I thought I would. Also from Dune, we've got Skydiver, an Owen Rubin joint. You're in a plane and you've got a target to hit. You jump out, release your parachute at ideally the last moment, and then aim for said target, trying not to get blown away from it by the wind. Much like Canyon Bomber, the main point of this game is to have 2 players going head to head, trying to outlast each other, but it can happily be played by a single person. It's not bad really, but you can kind of see a line between this title and a much more famous vector game that Atari would release next year, which of course is Lunar Lander. Obviously that game's coming up. Another more significant title is here. September 1978 sees the arrival of Super Breakout, the much anticipated sequel to the whopping hit 1976 original. Significantly, Super Breakout marks the official debut of one of Atari's greatest designers, and indeed one of the greatest arcade game designers ever. While Ed Logg did briefly work on Avalanche at the end of its dev cycle, as well as the Unreleased dirt bike, Super Breakout is the first game that he worked on from beginning to end. I have also seen things saying that Ed Rotberg also worked on Super Breakout, but I can't confirm that. The core gameplay of Breakout hasn't been tampered with a whole lot, but Super Breakout features 3 different modes that the player can choose from: Double Breakout, Cavity Breakout, and Progressive Breakout. Double gives you 2 paddles and 2 balls to play with. Cavity introduces cavities that can trap and release balls, potentially allowing for as many as 3 balls to be on the playfield. And Progressive Breakout, while also sounding kind of like an obscure music genre, only gives you 1 bat and ball, but the bricks will slowly descend down the screen, narrowing the playfield. While Super Breakout wasn't as huge a hit as the original game was, it still performed very well, shifting nearly 5,000 units. A fine performance indeed for Logg's first release title, although he is going to utterly eclipse it next year. Up next, we're going to cover 3 sports games, mainly because 2 of them are 2-player only, and as such they're kind of tricky for me to play properly. That doesn't mean these games weren't successful, mind you. October 1978's Atari Football, designed by Steve Bristow, was actually one of the biggest games of 1979, only beaten in the States by the almighty Space Invaders. The players may only be circles and crosses, but it's still a rather quick game of football, one where you pretty quickly get on with things, pass to your fellow circle, and hope it doesn't get intercepted by a cross, one with the trackball and get a little buzz of crowd noise when you score a touchdown. It's also definitely worth noting that a later 4-player version of this game was the official debut of the legendary Dave Buehrer. June 1979's Atari Baseball, meanwhile, is the official debut of Ed Rotberg, and it's my favourite of these. It's kind of easy to screw around with a baseball game even if you're having to control both teams, although it should be noted that in all of these games, some of the players on the pitch are computer controlled. This is certainly a lot more complex than the earlier Flyball, with there being a lot more players on the ground, and also being able to choose from various pitchers, as well as whether you want to swing or bunt the ball. Nicely done. Thirdly, April 1980 sees the release of Atari Soccer, which to me is slightly weaker than the football and baseball games. Not too bad, but pretty much what you would expect from such an old entry into the genre. Plus, it's one of those games where you're really better off just walking the ball into the goal as opposed to trying to shoot it past the keeper, as I've never been able to score in that more traditional way. Another thing that links all these games, and something you may be able to tell from how they're laid out, is that they're designed to be played on cocktail cabinets using trackballs. Atari Football in particular is often credited for being the game that popularised the trackball, previously something that was used to control radars and antennas in the military as a viable games controller. Before we get to 1978's other unreleased works, we have a lesser-known title by the name of Orbit from November, an early game by Owen Rubin that is, well, basically it's Space War, only in raster format. It seems odd that Atari would choose to make a clone of Space War in 1978, considering that the original game was already over 15 years old by this time, but according to Rubin himself on his website, Orbit was aimed at the European market, and he was given just 6 to 8 weeks to make the game. The most curious thing about Orbit is the cabinet, really, mainly because you've got this huge array of buttons that you can play around with. In the main, all these buttons do is change the type of game you're playing, things like messing around with the gravity settings, or the speed of objects such as the black hole and the space station. It's kind of excessive really, but still quite cool, and you can also change any of these settings in the middle of a game. Other than that, yeah, it's Space War with a few other little extras, such as using the aforementioned space station to refill and load out. Other than that, it's all about getting the opponent before they get you, and again, it's a game for 2 players only. If you want Space War or computer space style action, then Orbit certainly has a load of variations on the game for you to get stuck into. There's not a huge amount of mini golf arcade games kicking around, but this one here, Atari Mini Golf, hails from 1978. And honestly, it's not all that bad a fin as far as titles of this vintage go, feeling just like any standard top-down mini golf game. You get 30 shots per credit and this proto is basically complete. There's even pictures kicking around from a German trade magazine where the game is working in its cabinet. However, this was never released. No one's sure exactly why, maybe it just didn't test well. It's not known exactly who made this, but it quite possibly inspired Senti to make their own mini-golf game in 1985 with ex-Atari man, as many others at Senti were, Dennis Coble designing. That one did get released, and it's quite similar indeed to the older Atari prototype, only obviously there's a lot of graphical improvements and so on. Staying in 1978, here we have Boxer. This is, of course, a boxing game, with 2 fighters duking it out on a screen that is otherwise largely empty. Graphics didn't yet extend to a ring, unfortunately. This game was made by Michael Albor, and a lot of the info here comes from his interview on Atari Compendium. Boxer's main feature was a novel control system made by mechanical designer Jerry Leshak. You've got a pair of big rotary handles atop a big shaft. That's your joystick. You move the shaft to move the boxer, and punch by rotating the handles. It's meant to be quite a physical game. And unfortunately that was the problem, in that this joystick was very prone to breaking as testers got into the game, trashing the controls in mere minutes. Later revisions changed the controls and reduced the physicality, and with the main pull of the game gradually being diminished, Boxer ended up doomed to the vaults. Although a version of the game did actually come out for the Atari 2600, in the shape of Activision's Boxing from 1980. Now you may think this next one looks ridiculously simple for an arcade game. I mean, it looks exactly like an Atari 2600 title. And of course it is. This is Game 7 from 1977's Air-Sea Battle, in which you move your submarine's guns left and right and fire at targets above. This was one of the more popular games on the cart, and some corporate guy had the bright idea of making a version of this game for the arcade called Captain Seahawk, penciled in for 1978. According to Mike Albor, the arcade division didn't think the idea had any legs on the arcade floor, but they couldn't make the guy appreciate the differences between home games and arcade games. And so, Mike apparently just ported the game straight up, with no differences at all. Unsurprisingly, it tested terribly, the whole thing was scrapped, and no ROM of this arcade version is known to exist, although there is a big article all about Captain Seahawk on Games That Weren't, and it's fully covered in the Games That Weren't book. Wolfpack is another game that, if you were to randomly boot it in MAME, would look straightforward. It's a sub-game where you move around and fire torpedoes at various targets, with a bit of speech thrown in. Perfectly okay for 78. Again though, the pool is the cabinet. You view the action through a periscope that you then rotate around the monitor. Very cool stuff, and if it had released, it would have been the first game to feature digitised voices. Dennis Coble was the main man behind Wolfpack, and in his Atari Compendium interview he cites Seawolf, a very popular 1976 game from Dave Nuttin, as the main inspiration. You also view the action through a periscope in that one, but the rotary feature does make Wolfpack stand out. But alas, those old mechanical problems set in, the game gradually went on the back burner, and then it ended up cancelled. One reason cited being that Gene Lipkin, then president of Atari's arcade division, hated boats. According to Mike Albor, Lipkin was very prone to snap cancellations, which may explain the demise of a bunch of the early games in this vid. Projects often had something called a Lipkin switch, which programmers could throw quickly to make a game fault, in order to prevent Gene Lipkin from having a look at it and potentially cancelling it on the spot.
Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 1.
Technically this next game did come out, but it had a long story well worthy of inclusion. This is Tunnel Hunt from 1982, although originally it was called Tube Chase, and Owen Rubin worked on it in 1979. It was supposed to be a vector game where you flew down these tunnels at high speed, dogfighting it out with other ships that, yes, look a fair bit like TIE fighters. All very Star Wars, of course, and all quite exciting. In 1979, this game would have quite possibly been freaking gold, way advanced for the time. But Atari forever wanted changes to be made, never fully happy with the game's results in field testing. It eventually became a raster game. Everything was slowly made cheaper. Rubin claimed in the 1998 Golden Age Arcade Historian interview that around 70 changes were made. And after 2 years, Atari said the game was still too expensive, and they sold it to Exidy. Exidy could have released it under the name of Vertigo, but by 1981 the game wasn't testing as well, and so they sold it off to Century, who finally released it under the name of Tunnel Hunt, where its performance was mediocre. By that time the game was kind of out of date, and the ship had sailed. Many years later, Rubin was fond of jokingly saying to his colleague and close friend, Ed Rotberg, that 1989's Stun Runner was his ideal vision for Tube Chase, only 10 years earlier. We start 1979 proper in February, with some pinball. Atari had a couple things going on in the pin department. They made a few tables of their own, such as the Atarians, Middle-earth and Airborne Avenger, as well as a dedicated video pinball home console, which came out in 1977. And here in 1979, we have the video pinball arcade game, designed by Ed Logg and overseen by Dave Stubborn, a hardware man who worked on Atari's regular pinball machines. It's a pretty good bit of pinball, actually. Ed Logg's experience with Super Breakout certainly helps him to make a nice and speedy game, with a ball that moves quite nicely for the time, and while the table itself isn't exactly filled with features, it looks pretty good with the overlay. I'd actually say this has held up a fair bit better than the likes of Namco's GB, which also came out around this time. Also from 1979, we have a follow-up game to this which is even better, Solar War, which features a table designed by Dave Feuer. Naturally it's quite a similar deal, but the table's got even more going on, there's lots of nice sounds, and plenty of enjoyable play. For a pinball game from 1979, it's utterly excellent. Unfortunately, Solar War didn't get a big release. Only a few dedicated machines and a couple of hundred kits were made, and it appears as though all of them were bought up by a Greek operator. It's possible that this game's release was so minor because it was originally supposed to be a tie-in for Superman, but the deal fell through. Maze Subs isn't a particularly well-known game today, but it is actually another first of sorts, the first arcade game to come with 2 monitors. The play here is somewhat similar to the older likes of Space War and Gunfight, but the monitors certainly add something. The players have to find their opponent's hidden sub, using the sonar to track it, before blowing it away to score points. Not a bad design, and you can definitely see how the 2 monitors would make for quite a cool experience for 2 people, although you can also play this game against the computer. This was made by John Ray and Phil Hash. While this is Phil Hash's only credit, John Ray would be an engineer and producer who worked on a whole lot of Atari games, all the way up to 2002. Our next 2 games are quite notable. Atari is heading into the world of vector gaming. They weren't the first arcade company to go into vectors, Cinematronics beat them to the punch with 1977's Space Wars, but August 79 sees the arrival of Lunar Lander, complete with a vector engine created by Wendy Allen and a game designed by her and Rich Moore. The Lunar Lander concept itself wasn't original. There had been text-based games centred around landing on the moon since the late 60s, and from there a graphical version of the game, 1973's Moon Lander by Phil Burgess, was created for the DEC GT40. That's what Lunar Lander is primarily based on. You control your ship using a big old thruster, powering the engines with a button, and the simple aim is to successfully land on the moon, achieved by a combination of flying straight, not landing on anything uneven, and not landing too quickly. It seems easy, but it requires a lot of accuracy, especially if you're going for any of the bonus multipliers. It's a cracking game, really. An excellent arcade version of a computer game that was already pretty acclaimed, although it doesn't quite have some of the fun little extras that Moonlander has. Famously, that game features one of the first notable Easter eggs, in which you can find a McDonald's on the moon, and if you land next to it, the astronaut will get out and order a couple of cheeseburgers. Wendy Allen did want to include this in Lunar Lander as well, but alas, it got cut. However, the game still features some amusing bits of scolding whenever you screw up the landing, which you undoubtedly will. Lunar Lander shifted a few thousand units and got a lot of good write-ups, making it pretty damn good for Atari's first stab at a vector game. However, it would be utterly outshone by their second one. Here Here then is the biggest game we've done so far, and undoubtedly the best one. In fact, it's the best-selling arcade game in Atari's entire history. It's November 1979, and Atari unleash asteroids onto an unsuspecting marketplace. A game that evolved from what was originally supposed to be something derivative of cinematronic Space Wars into something truly special, one of the greatest arcade games ever made. Ed Logg was the main man behind the game's design, although the winning concept actually belongs to Lyle Raines. The initial game, known in development as Planet Grab and then Cosmos, featured an indestructible asteroid that the ships would have to avoid, and it was Raines who had the idea that the ship should be able to blow the asteroid up after he'd played the prototype and tried to shoot the aforementioned hunk of space rock. And so, you take the old template from Space War, with the thrust controls and buttons for turning, along with the useful addition of a teleport that's often used as a desperate last resort if you can't get out of the way, but now you're in a battle for survival against many asteroids that get faster as you shoot them and they break up, complete with the odd UFO that, while they can also be taken out by the big boulders, are also potentially shooting at you. The result is legendary, and still incredible to play now. Even the graphics here, with those beautifully clean vector lines, have held up completely. Also, there's the competition aspect. Asteroids was not the first game to feature a high score table where you could input your initials, as it was beaten to the punch there by XD's Starfire, but Asteroids popularised it, and that was just one of the many things that helped the game become a phenomenon. It unseated Space Invaders as the biggest arcade game around in the States, and it ultimately shifted over 100,000 units worldwide, making it the most successful arcade game in Atari's history. Quite simply, it's just as great now as it was 47 years ago, and it's still influencing plenty of other titles. Just about anything that involves flying around has asteroids in its DNA. Simply put, one of the best games ever made. With that, we've reached the end of the decade and the end of this first part. Obviously there's plenty more to come in the second part as we head into the 1980s, where we'll hit the ground running with 2 all-time greats and just go all out from there, through the switch from Atari Inc. to Atari Games and beyond, with many classic titles and a few that deserve more love. Hopefully you've enjoyed this first part, and until the next time, bye for now.